It was a peaceful morning in the Carter household. Elena Carter hummed softly as she flipped pancakes on the stove. The golden brown smell of syrup filled the kitchen. Her two children, Mia and Jordan, sat at the dining table, excitedly chatting about their plans for the day. Elena smiled at their innocent energy, feeling grateful for the life they had built. Elena was the kind of mother everyone admired. She worked hard, cared deeply, and always made time for her family. Despite life's challenges, she believed in staying positive and setting a good example for her children. Today felt like any other normal day, until the knock on the door. The sound startled her. It was unusual for anyone to visit this early. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, Elena walked to the door, her smile still lingering. As she opened it, her heart sank. Standing on the porch were two police officers, their expressions serious. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. "Are you Elena Carter?" he asked in a firm voice. "Yes, that's me," Elena replied, her voice faltering slightly. "Is something wrong?" "Ma'am, we have a warrant for your arrest," the officer said, holding up a piece of paper. "You are being charged with grand theft and fraud." Elena froze. Her mind raced. "What? That has to be a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "We're just doing our job, Mom," the second officer said, though his tone lacked sympathy. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Mia and Jordan peeked around the corner, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Mommy, what's happening?" Maya asked, her voice small and trembling. "It's okay, baby," Elena said, forcing herself to stay calm for their sake. "Mommy will be back soon." But inside, she felt like the world was crumbling. As the officers cuffed her hands, Elena couldn't hold back her tears. She looked at her children one last time before being led to the patrol car. Neighbors gathered outside their homes, whispering and pointing as the scene unfolded. Elena felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, but held her head high. She knew she had done nothing wrong. Inside the car, Elena sat in stunned silence. The charges didn't make sense. She had no idea how her name could be tied to something so serious. All she could think about was her children and how scared they must be. Meanwhile, back at the house, Mia clung to her brother, both of them crying. The pancakes on the stove began to burn, filling the kitchen with smoke. Their mother, their protector, was gone, and they didn't understand why. For Elena, this was just the beginning of a nightmare she never saw coming. And as the car drove away, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what, she would fight to prove her innocence and get back to her family. Elena Carter sat in the cold, hard chair of the police station, her hands trembling as she held the paper listing the charges against her. Grand theft, fraud. It was like reading a script for someone else's life, a stranger's life. None of this made sense. She had never stolen anything, never even dreamed of breaking the law. But here she was, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, feeling like the world had turned upside down. "Ma'am," a detective said as he walked into the room, his voice clipped and formal, "we have evidence tying you to several large transactions made with stolen funds. These funds were used to purchase luxury items, cars, jewelry, even properties." Elena's mouth fell open in shock. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't own anything like that. I'm a mother, my husband, and I live modestly. We don't even buy expensive clothes, let alone cars or jewelry." The detective raised an eyebrow. "The evidence doesn't lie," he said, sliding photographs across the table. Elena stared at them. They showed someone who resembled her, a woman with her same complexion and build, walking out of stores and signing documents. But the woman's face was partially obscured in most of the photos, making it hard to see her clearly. "That's not me," Elena cried, her voice growing louder. "I've never been to these places. You have the wrong person." The detective didn't seem convinced. "We'll let the court decide that," he said, standing up. "For now, you're You're being processed and will remain in custody until your hearing." Alina's heart sank. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone listen to her, but the walls seemed to close in around her. She thought of her children, Mlia and Jordan, who were probably still crying at home, scared and confused. She thought of Marcus, her husband, who was away at a mayoral summit in another city. He had no idea what was happening. How would he react when he found out? As the officers led her to a holding cell, Alina kept replaying the detective's words in her mind. Who could have done this? Someone had stolen her identity and used it to ruin her life. But who? And why? Hours turned into a blur of waiting, fear, and hopelessness. In the cell, Alina met other women who were also awaiting their hearings. Some of them gave her sympathetic looks. Others ignored her completely. She sat on the edge of the metal bench, hugging herself for warmth, trying not to cry in front of strangers. Back at home, Marcus finally received a call. His assistant, Rachel, sounded frantic. "Marcus, it's about Alina," she said, her voice barely steady. "She's been arrested." "What?" Marcus nearly shouted. "Arrested? For what?" Rachel explained the charges and the chaos that had unfolded that morning. Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. His wife, his loving, honest, hard-working wife, was being accused of crimes that didn't fit her character in the slightest. "I'm coming back immediately," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Call the best lawyer you can find. I won't let this happen to her." Meanwhile, in the shadows of the city, the real criminal watched the news report about Alina's arrest with a satisfied smirk. Their plan had worked perfectly, and for now, they felt untouchable. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Marcus Carter wasn't just a mayor. He was a man determined to fight for his family. And Alina, she wasn't going down without a fight. Alina sat nervously in the courtroom, the heavy silence pressing down on her. She had never imagined she would find herself here, fighting for her freedom in a place that seemed so cold and impersonal. The room was filled with strangers, some in suits, some in uniforms, and all of them were watching her as if she were guilty before even hearing her side of the story. The judge, Frederick Monroe, sat high above everyone else on his chair, looking down at her with a cold expression. Alina had heard things about him, how he was known for being strict, especially when it came to people of color. He had a reputation for handing down harsh sentences, and now she was about to find out if that reputation was true. Alina's lawyer, Samuel Grant, a quiet but determined man, stood beside her. He was doing his best to explain that the charges against Alina were a mistake, that her identity had been stolen and used by someone else. He presented the evidence that Alina had never purchased any of the items listed in the charges and that she had no knowledge of the crimes. But Judge Monroe didn't seem interested in the details. He listened with a stern face, occasionally glancing at the papers in front of him. His cold gaze never softened, and Alina felt like he wasn't even hearing her lawyer. Every word Samuel spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears. "Your Honor," Samuel said, trying to remain calm, "my client is innocent. She has been wrongfully accused. There are clear signs of identity theft, and we have evidence to prove she could not have committed these crimes." But Judge Monroe just tapped his fingers on the desk, not giving Samuel much attention. "I've heard enough," the judge said in a deep, authoritative voice. "The evidence speaks for itself." Alina's heart raced. What evidence? The pictures they had shown her were unclear, blurry, and showed only a vague resemblance to her. The more she tried to explain herself, the more the judge seemed to dismiss her. As the trial went on, Alina could feel the weight of the room growing heavier. The prosecutor, Anna Fields, kept pushing her case, suggesting that Alina was guilty because she had been caught in some photos and had the same name as the person who committed the crimes. But it all felt so wrong, like they were judging her based on who she was, not the truth. "I don't believe your story, Ms. Carter," Judge Monroe finally said, turning to her. "It seems like just another excuse to avoid responsibility for your actions." Alina wanted to shout, to defend herself, But she knew that doing so would only make things worse. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. She couldn't let them see her break down. She had to be strong for her children, for Marcus, and for herself. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Monroe made his final decision. Elena held her breath, praying that the judge would see the truth. But when he finally spoke, his words struck like a heavy blow. "Given the seriousness of these charges," the judge said, looking directly at Elena, "I hereby sentence you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." Elena couldn't believe it. Life in prison. For something she didn't do. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Elena barely heard them. Her mind was spinning, her body numb. As she was led away in handcuffs, she glanced one last time at her lawyer, who looked as shocked as she felt. Samuel had fought as hard as he could, but it hadn't been enough. Elena felt completely helpless. But as she was taken out of the courtroom, something inside her shifted. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't. She knew that Marcus, her husband, would never let this injustice stand. He would find a way to get her out of here. And she would fight with everything she had, because she knew the truth. And one day, they would know it too. Elena was led through the cold, narrow halls of the prison, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She could barely process what had just happened. The words the judge had spoken still echoed in her mind. Life in prison without parole. It felt like a horrible dream, one she couldn't escape from. But this wasn't a dream. It was her reality. And now she had to figure out how to survive in this strange, frightening place. As the metal door slammed behind her, Elena was led to a small gray cell. The walls were bare, and the air smelled stale. She stood there for a moment, staring at the narrow bed and the toilet in the corner. The sound of other women talking and moving around in the distant halls filled the silence. Elena couldn't even process the fact that she was behind bars. It felt unreal. She was a mother, a wife, a person who had done nothing wrong. And now she was here, alone, in a place where she didn't belong. Her thoughts kept drifting to her children, Mia and Jordan. How would they understand this? How could she explain to them that their mother, who had always been there for them, was now locked away, accused of crimes she didn't commit? The thought made her chest tighten. She couldn't bear the thought of them growing up without her. Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. She fought back the tears. She couldn't let them see her weak. She needed to be strong, for her kids, for Marcus, and for herself. She whispered a silent promise. She would find a way out of this. She couldn't give up. Meanwhile, outside the prison, Marcus had just finished a meeting in the city when he got the call. His assistant, Rachel, spoke quickly, her voice full of panic. "Marcus, it's Elena. She's been sentenced. Life in prison without parole." Marcus froze. The words didn't make sense. Life in prison. For his wife. It was like the world had just shattered in front of him. "What are you talking about? This can't be right. Elena didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice rising in disbelief. Rachel explained the details. The trial, the charges, and the judge's decision. Marcus couldn't believe it. His mind raced. This had to be a mistake. Elena was innocent, but no one seemed to care. The idea that she could spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she didn't commit made his blood boil. "I'm coming back," Marcus said, his voice cold with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes to get her out." The flight back home felt like it took forever. All Marcus could think about was Elena and the injustice she was facing. He thought about their life together, the plans they had made, and how quickly it had all been turned upside down. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this happen to her. He would fight for her, no matter what it took. Back at the prison, Elena lay on the small, uncomfortable bed, staring up at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of her children and Marcus. What would he do? What could he do? She trusted him. She knew he would find a way to help her. But as the hours passed, a sense of hopelessness began to creep in. What if she couldn't get out of here? But no, she couldn't think like that. She had to hold on to hope. She had to believe that the truth would come out. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother. And one way or another, she would prove it. Marcus's determination to free Alina grew stronger each day. As soon as he returned home, he wasted no time. His first call was to Amara Bennett, a high-profile civil rights attorney who had a reputation for fighting for justice, especially in cases like Alina's. She was known for her tireless work and her ability to stand up against the powerful forces that tried to crush the innocent. If there was anyone who could help, it was her. When Amara answered, Marcus didn't hold back. "Amara, I need your help. My wife, Alina, was sentenced to life in prison for a crime she didn't commit. We've already presented evidence, but the judge won't listen. Please, you have to help me." Amara listened carefully, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sorry to hear this, Marcus. I'll look into it. I promise we'll find a way to uncover the truth." Marcus felt a small flicker of hope. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he trusted Amara. She had helped so many people in similar situations. She would do everything she could to bring Alina home. As Amara began her investigation, Marcus used his position as mayor to gather as much information as possible. He went through the trial records, re-examined the evidence, and even reached out to other lawyers. He wasn't going to let Alina sit in prison for a crime she didn't commit, not while he had the power to do something about it. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus was growing frustrated. But Amara kept assuring him that they were making progress. She spent hours digging into the case, looking for any cracks in the prosecution's story. Then, one evening, she called Marcus with a breakthrough. "I found something," Amara said over the phone. "There's a pattern. The judge, Monroe, has been involved in multiple cases where minorities were unfairly sentenced. And it gets worse. He has connections to private prison companies. These companies stand to profit when people like Alina are sent to prison for long sentences. This isn't just a mistake. This is corruption." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that Alina's case was part of a much larger problem made him angry. The judge wasn't just biased. He was involved in something far more sinister. "I knew something was wrong," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "This wasn't just about Alina. This was about a system that doesn't care about the truth." Amara continued, "I'll dig deeper into his financial records and see if we can tie him directly to the private prison companies. But we're going to need solid proof. We can't let him get away with this." The next few days were a blur. Marcus didn't sleep much, working late into the night. He and Amara went through documents, phone records, and emails, searching for any hint of corruption. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Judge Monroe was deeply involved in a system that made money off the suffering of people like Alina. Meanwhile, Alina sat in her prison cell, the days blending into one another. She tried to stay strong, but every morning it got harder to hold on. She thought of her children, how they must be missing her, and how she couldn't be there to guide them. But every time she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, she reminded herself, Marcus was out there, fighting for her. Finally, after weeks of investigation, Amara called with the news Marcus had been waiting for. "I've got the evidence," Amara said. "We've got the smoking gun. The judge's ties to the private prison companies are undeniable. This is big." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "Then we go to court. We get Alina out of there," Amara agreed. "It's time." The day Marcus got the call from Amara was the day everything started to change. The evidence they had uncovered, proof of Judge Monroe's ties to private prison companies, was huge. They finally had the truth in their hands, and now they needed to make sure everyone knew about it. Marcus knew that the more people who heard Alina's story, the harder it would be for anyone to ignore the injustice she had faced. Amara suggested they take the case to the media. "We can't just keep this to ourselves, Marcus. The public needs to know what's really going on. If we want to bring down Monroe, we have to make this bigger than just a court case." Marcus agreed, though it made him nervous. He had always kept his family's life private. But now, the world needed to see Alina's story. He contacted Rachel, his assistant, and asked her to get in touch with the top news outlets in the city. Within hours, the story of Alina Carter's wrongful conviction and the corruption behind it was spreading like wildfire. News outlets began reporting on the case, covering every detail: how Alina had been sentenced to life in prison for crimes she didn't commit, and how a judge with known biases had been involved in the trial. The headline, "Racist Judge Sentences Innocent Mother to Life in Prison," appeared in newspapers, online articles, and across social media platforms. As the story gained traction, people started to speak out. Some of the citizens of the city were shocked, while others were outraged. They couldn't believe that someone like Alina, a loving mother who had never been in trouble before, was facing such a harsh sentence. Many of them also shared their own stories of discrimination in the justice system and how they felt like their voices had never been heard. It was clear Alina's case had sparked something deep within the community. Marcus couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. People were starting to see what had happened, and it wasn't just his fight anymore. The community was rallying behind Alina. But that didn't mean the fight was over. They still had to bring their case to court, and Monroe wasn't going to give up his power easily. In the meantime, Alina heard about the media coverage. Through letters from her lawyer, she learned that people were starting to question the fairness of her trial. She had no idea how this was happening, but hearing that people were supporting her from the outside gave her a renewed sense of hope. As the protests grew in size outside the courthouse, people began to demand action. Groups of citizens, civil rights activists, and even some local celebrities spoke out in support of Alina. They created petitions, organized peaceful marches, and called for an investigation into Judge Monroe's conduct. The pressure on the justice system to reopen Alina's case was becoming too great to ignore. Judge Monroe, however, was not backing down. In a press statement, he denied all allegations of bias and corruption. He claimed that his decision was based on the law and that he had done nothing wrong. But the more people dug into his past, the clearer it became that he had been using his position for personal gain, profiting from the suffering of innocent people like Alina. Marcus, standing beside Amara, knew this fight was far from over. But with the truth finally coming to light, he felt more determined than ever to free Alina. He couldn't let the system keep his family apart any longer. As the media continued to shine a spotlight on Alina's case, public pressure on the court system reached a boiling point. It wasn't just about Alina anymore. It was about righting a wrong that had affected many others and ensuring that the truth was heard. The courtroom was packed. It was the day of the new hearing, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The media was there, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling notes, and citizens filling the seats. This was no longer just a case about Alina Carter. It was a case that represented the fight against corruption and injustice. The world was watching. Marcus stood by Alina's side, his heart pounding. He had never felt more nervous in his life, but he was also more determined than ever. He couldn't lose. Not when so much was at stake. Not when Alina, his wife, and the mother of their children, had been wronged in such a devastating way. Amara, who had worked tirelessly on the case, was confident. She stood at the front of the courtroom, prepared to expose the truth. The evidence they had gathered, Judge Monroe's financial connections to private prison companies, was irrefutable. This was their chance to make everything right. As the hearing began, Alina sat quietly beside Marcus, her hands trembling but her eyes focused. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure the justice system worked for everyone, not just the powerful. Amara stepped up to the podium, her voice calm and commanding. "Your Honor, members of the court," she began, addressing the judge who had sentenced Alina so harshly. "We are here today not only to clear the name of Alina Carter, but to expose a pattern of corruption and bias that has been allowed to continue unchecked." The judge, now visibly uncomfortable under the spotlight, shifted in his seat. He had not expected this level of scrutiny. He had thought he could silence the truth with his power. But now, with the entire city watching, things were about to change. Amara continued, "We have uncovered evidence of Judge Monroe's involvement with private prison companies. These companies profit from keeping people locked up for as long as possible, and it is clear that he has been using his position to push harsh sentences for financial gain." Elena Carter was the victim of this corrupt system. A murmur went through the courtroom as Amara showed the evidence. Documents linking Monroe to the private prison companies, emails discussing his financial gain from long prison sentences, and photos showing his close ties to key figures in the industry. The judge's face turned pale as the truth began to unfold in front of everyone. He had never imagined that his actions would be exposed like this. The room fell into a heavy silence, and even the prosecutor, who had once supported the charges against Elena, seemed unsure of how to respond. Elena sat still, her heart racing. She had never felt more alive, even in the midst of her fear. This was it. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. "I know this is a difficult truth to face," Amara said, turning toward the judge, "but Elena Carter does not belong in prison. She was wrongfully convicted, and the evidence we've presented shows that she is innocent. We ask that you reverse the sentence and set her free." Marcus watched as Judge Monroe sat silently, clearly defeated. He had no choice now but to acknowledge the truth. There was no denying the evidence that had been laid out before him. The pressure from the media, the public, and the court was too much to ignore. Finally, the judge stood. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice strained. I have no choice but to overturn the previous sentence," he said, his voice shaking. "The conviction will be reversed, and Miss Carter will be released immediately." A wave of relief swept over Marcus as he held Elena's hand. The room erupted into applause. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Marcus, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was enough to let him know she had not given up hope. The fight was over. Elena was finally free. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of emotions, relief, triumph, and a sense of justice finally being served. Elena stood, stunned and overwhelmed, as the judge declared her exonerated. For a moment, she could hardly believe it. After all she had been through, after spending weeks in a prison cell, she was finally free. It was a victory she would never forget. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the hearing, Marcus pulled Elena into a tight embrace. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "I told you we'd get through this. I never stopped believing in you." Elena smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never doubted Marcus, but the journey to this moment had been long and painful. She felt like she could finally breathe again. Amara, who had worked tirelessly on the case, walked over to them with a look of pride on her face. "You did it," she said to Elena. "This is the victory you deserve." "I can't believe it's finally over," Elena said, her voice still shaking with emotion. "I can't believe I'm free." The crowd in the courtroom had quieted down, and Elena could feel the eyes of the people around her. She had become a symbol of strength and resilience to many. Over the weeks, her story had spread far and wide. The media had covered every step of her fight for justice, and now people all over the city were cheering for her. It wasn't just about Elena anymore. It was about a system that needed to change, and about the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. As Marcus and Elena left the courtroom, they were met with a sea of reporters and cameras. But this time, the questions were different. They were no longer about the charges or the trial. They were about Elena's journey, her strength, and the fight for justice that had brought her to this moment. "I want to thank everyone who supported me," Elena said, standing at the steps outside the courthouse. "This victory is not just mine. It's for everyone who has ever been wrongfully accused or silenced. We all deserve to be heard." The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, Elena felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. She had her family back, and she had a new sense of purpose. She knew her fight wasn't over. There were still many who were suffering in silence, and she would use her voice to make sure they were heard too. As the days passed, Alina began to rebuild her life. She spent time with her children, catching up on all the moments she had missed while she was locked away. Marcus was there by her side every step of the way, and together they began to heal from the trauma they had faced. But Alina's story didn't end with her release. She became a passionate advocate for justice reform, speaking at rallies and using her experience to help others who had been wrongfully convicted. She worked alongside organizations fighting for fairness in the legal system, determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. Alina knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with Marcus by her side and with the support of the community behind her, she felt stronger than ever. Together, they had faced the darkest of times and emerged victorious. In the end, Alina's story wasn't just about the fight for freedom. It was about the power of truth, love, and unwavering determination. She had been wronged, but through courage and support, she had found her way back to the light. And no matter what came next, Alina Carter would never give up on fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a voice.